Hi, everyone. Welcome to eLearnChat, where you always learn and meet someone new. And today we've got with us my good friend and co host, Lesley Price. She's with www.learnappeal.com. Lesley, how have you been?
I've been very good, thank you. We had an absolutely beautiful Easter weekend where it was,
Great.
glorious sunshine. And then we had a weekend of kind of mixed weather and rain.
Hmm.
So, it's back to the UK weather map.
I know, but you've
You
had
never
pretty
know
nice
what you're going to
weather.
get.
Even when we were out there, it was beautiful weather. So, no complaints.
Yeah.
So, anyway, here we
Anyway,
go.
I'm
Oh,
absolutely. Are we going? Do you want music?
let's go our music and then we'll introduce our wonderful
Okay.
guest. And we are back. Lesley, would you like to do the honors of introducing our guest today?
Yes, I would. I'm absolutely delighted that my friend and colleague, Steve Wheeler, Dr. Steve Wheeler, is going to be with us on the show tonight, talking about his new book, which is he might even hold it up for us if he's got one in his hand,
I
maybe.
do. Yeah.
Ah, there you go. Digital learning in organizations. Um, Before we came live on the show, I was just sharing with Rick that Steve is one of the people that I know that has crossed boundaries. So, although Steve, yes, has been a professor in a couple of organizations, I believe Plymouth University, rings a bell, it's the last place he was in. He also crosses boundaries into organizations, into corporate learning. And I'm hoping that that's what he's now going to be talking about when he talks about his book. So, welcome, Steve. It's fantastic to have you on the show.
Thank you, Lesley, and thank you, Rick. It's good to talk to you both, albeit using this kind of medium for a change.
Yep. No, we're glad you could make it. Now you've been an academic for a long time, but you've also, like Lesley says, crossed the divide, had work with corporations, and you crossed the international boundaries too. You do teaching in different places, and you probably do consulting in these. What motivated you to write this book?
This was an interesting one, Rick, because normally I've in the past I've written books about school and university education, and particularly things like digital learning, digital connections, social media, mobile learning, those kind of things. So when I was at Learning Technologies last year, I was talking to Donald H. Taylor, the chair of the conference, and he said, "You ought to go over to Kogan Page over there. They've got a stand over there. Go and speak to them because they're looking for people might have a book in them." So I walked over to them, not knowing what to talk about, and they said, "Oh, do you have a book in you?" And I said, "Well, I might have." What's it going to be called? So I said, digital learning in organizations, just pulling an idea out of my head, And they said, well, okay, get back to us with the proposal. I thought, oh no, I've got to do it now. And the interesting thing about it was that because it's about learning and development instead of about schools or education in universities, suddenly I had to think laterally. I had to think about things in a new context, and so it's been a bit of a challenge for me to write a book about learning and development. But I feel that you know hopefully it hits the mark in several places because I'm not talking about the future in terms of what we can expect in terms of technology. I'm talking about trends and about things that I think we'll see in L&D in the future.
So, what's one of the main trends that you're seeing right now?
I'll give you three, shall I?
Three is good.
Three really important trends that kind of go hand in hand, really. The first one is mobile learning, the idea that we are learning wherever we are now rather than in a specific location. So once we had ICT suites or computer labs, but now computing, of course, can be done anywhere, and so can connecting with other people and with content. So mobile learning is important. The second area, which is quite important, is social learning. We're going to be, I think, much more socially connected with each other through these technologies. And thirdly, I believe we're going to be very, very personal in our learning in the future. We're going to be not just in time, but just for me and just enough type of learning. I think those are the trends that we're seeing accelerating in L&D right now.
Are you finding that people now aren't learning as deeply, but they're learning a lot of other little things? In other words, they don't go deep into the process, but they go into, like you said, what do I need now?
Mm. Well, I mean, we call that micro learning, don't we?
Yes.
The idea of learning as in a micro way, learning in digestible chunks. Now, I think that's legitimate in certain areas, especially if you've got something like a problem that comes up which is unique, you've not seen it before, and you want to find out a way around it. So you'll go onto YouTube or you'll connect with your network of colleagues and you'll ask them a question and that will pop an answer and you'll try it. I suppose that you could call that micro learning, but I think there are also legitimate, deeper types of learning happening as well in organizations. Where we come up with a large-scale solution, or we come up with we come up against a large problem which is persistent, and deeper learning is required there. So I think we see both types of learning happening, simultaneously.
So in your book, Steve, what kind of topics do you cover? I'm just trying to draw you out a bit so that people can get an overview of what's in your book and why they should not only go out and buy it, but actually read it when they've bought it. Because I know a lot of people get books and they sit on the shelf. So, and that's not the you that I know. The you that I know is a very practical person.
Well, there are a lot of practical case studies in the book. So, for instance, I have interviewed something like about 20 different industry leaders from around the globe, from America and Canada all the way across Europe down into places like Australia. People who have, who are tried and trusted people in the world of L&D. I'm not going to name any names, but you'll probably guess who I mean. And these people have interviewed them and talked to them about the practical solutions that they've been devising and creating to meet specific problems. But if you want to know what's in the book, there are several chapters, for instance, on change and innovation. In fact, the first two chapters deal exclusively with change and what it means to organizations, and how can we cope with change, the pace it's going, the accelerated aspects of pace. How do we innovate on low budgets or no budgets? How do we survive in a time when there's rapid evolution of ideas and markets are disappearing, new ones are appearing very quickly, new technologies are emerging. So there's a whole range of stuff around that maelstrom of what it means to be in the middle of change. So I also present a new change model, which is based on Christensen's model, but it has, I'm giving away some of the content now, but there's a psychological event horizon, I believe, where an organization hits that, and if they cross that point, they never ever want to go back to where they were before. But there's also a caveat there that if you go past that point too quickly, you could hit inertia again, because people react to rapid change that is too disruptive.
Or you get sucked into the black hole.
Some interesting ideas there.
Yeah, or you can get sucked back into the black hole after that event horizon. Got to be careful with that. But it's interesting. You're bringing up two subjects that are near and dear to me. That's change management and innovation, because they're similar to each other, and yet they're also kind of at odds with each other, because sometimes it's very hard for a company to change and be innovative at the same time. But it's fascinating, because change management is something that companies are really struggling with all over the place, because how do you really respond to this rapid a change? And we're doubling our knowledge of our technological expertise. Literally every decade we're doubling what we had before, which is an enormous amount already if you consider what we had like in the early 1900s. It's like cavemen to now. It's a little scary. What is the trick in your view with change management to make it work well with people, especially larger organizations which tend not to move very quickly?
Yeah. Well, I've worked with some of the largest organizations in the world. I worked for 15 years as a manager in the National Health Service, which a lot of people don't know about. And I've also worked in small companies. I was the CEO of my own record label back in the 80s,
Oh,
which
interesting.
is a very small company with just about 10 people working in it. But so I know about scalability, and put it that way, and I can see the differences between large and smaller organizations. Where change is vital in some, and maybe in others it's resisted a little bit because maybe they don't need to change right now. So I think that there are various aspects of change agency. I like to call it change agency because I think we have control over how much we change within our organization, depending on the size of it and depending on who's pulling the purse strings. So in the NHS, for instance, a lot of change came in quite rapidly. I was responsible, or partly responsible, for introducing computers onto the wards in the hospital. And when I first came up with the proposal, some of the nurses were saying, that'll never happen. We won't have computers on the wards, firstly because we can't afford it, and secondly, none of us will ever have the time to learn to use it. And so my job there was to try and convince people that, yes, it's coming and you're not going to be able to stop it, but to actually keep up with these trends, you're going to have to learn how to use it, and we're going to give you a strategy how to do that. And so partly it's to do with convincing people, it's winning hearts and minds, but also I discovered that if you can find champions within each department, people who are maybe opinion leaders, or, I mean, Everett Rogers said this many years ago, and he's still right. In the 50s, he talked about this idea of opinion leaders. If you can find opinion leaders who people respect, and they are early adopters of the new ideas or the new technologies, then that's half the battle won. But you won't ever win everyone's hearts and minds.
That's true.
It's interesting what you're saying, Steve. And Rick, you don't know this one. I've actually done qualifications in change management. I am a qualified, registered change management practitioner, whatever that may be. But change was a huge issue. And when I was dealing with, when I was working at Becta, and I was dealing both with senior management in the organization, dealing with senior civil servants, dealing with ministers, dealing with senior people in both public and private sector, they wanted to know, oh yeah, but what qualifies you to do this, Lesley? And so Becta, in their wisdom, actually sent me on this course just to give me the letters after my name. I never use them, but it was actually incredibly useful when I was working with people at senior level, because they would want to know what gives this, woman the right to come along and tell us she knows about change.
It was your Claymore and the fact that you had your 3 initials. Yeah.
Well, whatever. But it's just interesting that change management was actually, I suppose, because my background was in marketing and applied business economics, change marketing or change management is actually a huge part of both of these topic areas. I don't know if you would agree with that, Steve. You maybe haven't studied them, but it was a big overlap.
Well, I think there is an overlap there between those and other professional areas as well. I think I first started writing about change in '92, I think it was. That was my first article on change management. And it's not going away. We need people involved in change who understand the dynamics of it. I guess also the psychology of it as well. I'm a psychologist partly because of that reason. I was interested in people's responses to rapid change, and a lot of my studies involved the psychological aspects of that.
Now, are you actually a psychologist?
What else in your book then, Steve? Sorry, I'm just going to...
Oh, no, I was just asking Steve if he actually was a psychologist.
I am a psychologist, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. So what else? So what other things can we find out in your book, Steve? I need to go out and buy this one now, don't I?
Yeah, so do I, actually, by the way.
I've sold about 3 copies so far. I think Dad's got 2 of them over there, but yeah. So what else is in the book? Well, there's a whole chapter on game-based learning, And there's another chapter which I think is really vital, which links into change management on digital readiness. So my argument there is that an organization is digitally ready when the core or critical mass of people within it are digitally ready. So the people are the intellectual property or the capital, if you like, of the organization. And if you can get that right, then the organization will move forward into innovative practices through technology. So the digital readiness for me is where people are digitally literate. In other words, where they are able to harness the power of the technology and make it do what they need it to do, so that they can do their jobs better, so they can be more so they can increase their productivity, so they can open new markets, so that they can communicate with each other better. There's a whole range of things that come under digital literacy, and it's a growth area in its own right. So I had to dedicate a whole chapter to it.
That's great. Now, you mentioned earlier, this just caught my attention. I know Lesley and I met on Twitter. I think it was during the Olympics when they were in England, I believe, if I'm not wrong.
2012.
And this is quite a few years ago. We met, just talked about different things, about probably a decade ago. And we were talking about music a lot. I think Brian May was playing or something. We were talking about different people. And you said you had a record label. Now, that's always fascinating. Are you a musician too?
Yeah, I guess I am. Yeah, I learned the guitar when I was 15. I taught myself the piano when I was about 20, and
That's great.
learned other instruments between then. Did a lot of songwriting, played a lot of different gigs with different bands, and mainly in the 80s. I was a new wave and punk artist in the 80s.
Interesting.
So our music was very loud and very fast and very furious.
That's cool. That's absolutely cool. And
Can't you see the keyboard in the background, Rick?
Well, yeah,
He's
but I
got
was wondering.
in the back of his library, there's a keyboard.
Yep.
Oh, it was one of the first
actually-
things I noticed.
Yeah.
That's actually a DX7 over there, a Yamaha DX7. They're quite rare now.
The-
That was one of the first digital keyboards ever.
Yeah, and they're still making great keyboards. Yamaha's pretty darn good at this. One of my friends has, I don't know if he's got that one or probably the later version of that one. He just loves it. They're not cheap either. It's a professional instrument. It's pretty nice. Well, no, but what I liked about that is, as a musician, it's all about timing. It's understanding the timing, and how many people in e-learning or training on the whole have no sense of timing. It's just an interesting thing how we negate some of these things, because timing is so important in learning, and yet it's ignored by a lot of people. It's timing. What do you mean by timing? Or how you introduce something, the pace at which you learn, all the things that music teaches someone. Timing, the emotional impact of learning, being through some emotional, we can strike a chord, no pun intended, in the person based on a feeling, a sentiment, something that triggers that memory, and that's how you get retention. But that's why when you said you were a record label person, and I did notice the instrument, I was going, gee, you must be a musician. And when he says psychologist, you've got the perfect trifecta of things going on. That's what I'm finding very interesting. And I know when Lesley talks about somebody she likes, they must be pretty good people. So we know she's discreet about things. So
Steve and I have also go back quite a long time. Again, probably, I think Steve and we met on Twitter originally. I'm sure we did. Because you were far more involved in academic stuff than in, I was a real crossover because of the work that I was doing. So I say I'd known people on the corporate side of e-learning, and I was just absolutely delighted when you started coming along to learning technologies and sharing experiences with the corporate world, which rather than just the academic, and that seems to have continued. Am I right, Steve?
I didn't catch the last bit of that, Lesley. What was the last sentence again? The question?
I said that it seems to have continued, that your crossover between academia and the corporate learning world, really now is you are one of the people who is invariably at the Learning Technologies conference and expo. You're one of,
Yeah.
you do keynotes there.
Yeah.
You run seminars there. You speak all over the world now at corporate conferences, not
Yeah.
just academic.
Well, yeah, I guess that's true. The thing about being a crossover speaker or academic or whatever you want to call me is that I learn from each different context. So if I go into a primary school, I'm going to learn something new, which could be applicable to a large organization later on, or I'll learn something in a corporate setting which I can later bring to a university somewhere. I do, as you rightly say, do consultancy work around the world. I had a 2-week residency down in New Zealand last year before I came to keynote the Learning Technologies Asia event in Singapore. So I had 2 weeks of intensive work down in New Zealand, at a university there as a resident academic. And some of the stuff that I learned there, I was able to bring immediately to Singapore to speak at the keynote at the Learning Technologies event. It was the inaugural event in Singapore, and that's where I actually, I suppose, came up with the idea of the new change model, which I've since published. I kind of presented that for the first time in Singapore, so you can see the synergy there that happens. I think a lot of things are transferable.
I totally and utterly agree with you. So to go back to your book, we've had the change bit, we've had the the digital readiness. So what else can I expect when I read it? What else can those who are joining us today expect when they read it? He's having to look at the book now to remind himself.
The chapter that I really like. Yeah.
Oh, nice. I like it.
I suppose I've been saddled with the title of futurist. I'm not really a futurist. I don't do crystal ball gazing, but I alluded at the start that I like to study trends, and I like to study trajectories within those trends as well. And so a lot of the things I talk about in that in that chapter 11, which is the final chapter, is some of the technological trends I see, such as artificial intelligence, and how poorly it's being applied. I take a critical view of this. People are hyping up artificial intelligence, saying, "Oh, it's going to take all our jobs, and it's going to be doing this for us and that for us." But I find that artificial intelligence at the moment is quite bland. There's very little happening that is applicable. This might be controversial, but there's very little happening and being developed in AI at the moment that is applicable directly to L&D right now. I can think of 2 things. You might think of more, but chatbots, for instance. Mm-hmm. That's a very low, narrow form of artificial intelligence. And learning analytics, again, it's a very narrow form of AI. We haven't yet, and I don't think we will for a long time, reach the point where we have artificial general intelligence, where computers can actually match completely, universally, everything that the mind can do. And that means that we're so far away from artificial superintelligence, it's laughable. And yet people still are eulogizing about it, and they're saying all the wonderful things about AI will do this and do that. I think it's very much stalled at the moment. There's very little happening that is interesting right now.
There's a lot of marketing happening, Steve, and you're so right. And that's because a lot of people aren't technical. They think they can log into a computer and they're techies. No, I used to be a Forth and Prolog programmer. That was AI back in the 70s and 80s, more in the 80s. It couldn't do that much. I mean, you could do some interesting, fun things, but if you remember, being a psychologist, there was a program called ELIZA. Do you remember that one? ELIZA was fun. It was a lot of fun. It wasn't very big a program, but it took your answers and kind of threw them back at you in a very analytical way. But it was a lot of fun, and sometimes what came out of it made it seem like it was very intelligent. It was just good pattern matching. But you're right. I mean, artificial intelligence, until pattern matching is at the level where it can come close to what our brains can do, is nothing more than preordained steps in something or other. There were lots of things about, Watson? I think IBM's Watson, when it was on Jeopardy, one, but they had given him all the answers or the questions first because they
Yeah.
said it would take too long to really figure out. So it didn't win by any stretch of being good. It just won because they cheated to make it win to prove a point. And so it can do some analytical studies, but the amount of I don't know, it's pretty limited right now. And you're right. I don't know how far we are from ever getting beyond that. Maybe 100 years, maybe 500 years. Who knows? We are getting better at it, but we're still far. And the tools
Because,
are getting
because
better. Yeah.
how do you bring in, because part of our intelligence, okay, I'm going to sound, probably typical Lesley here. Part of our intelligence is actually our emotions.
Yeah.
And how do you recreate emotion
You don't.
in a machine?
Not easily.
I've watched all the Doctor Who things, so I know all about the Cybermen and the Daleks and everything else. And I've watched, E.T. Go Home and whatever. And E.T. is probably the nearest one that comes to actually bringing in emotion. But a lot of our intelligence is emotion driven. Isn't
Well,
it?
interestingly,
Am I
Gerd
wrong?
Leonard, who's a colleague of mine and yours as well, Lesley, you probably know him as well, I think. Gerd Leonard recently said something quite interesting. He said that that the future of L&D and AI will mean that computers will never be able to trespass upon the areas that are uniquely human, such as emotions, such as intuition, such as the ability to be able to empathize, these kind of areas. He said that what they will do, they will supplant areas which are mundane or dangerous or boring. And that's useful because that means that we are then released to do other things which are much more cognitively engaging or perceptually rich or whatever. So I think he's right in that sense that AI is limited, but it will have its uses, and we've got to be prepared for that. We've got to be prepared for certain changes. Robotics is very similar, to AI. It's been hyped beyond belief. That the robot Sophia, which you may have seen, broke the news last year. It was awarded citizenship of Saudi Arabia, which is bizarre. But basically, that was also pre-programmed in the same way as Joseph Weizenbaum pre-programmed basically Eliza. It was string matching, pattern matching, and it gave a semblance of intelligence. But if you ask it a question which is not programmed to answer, it'll be like the machines at the supermarket checkout. Unexpected item in the bagging area, and I don't know, and it'll stop.
Well, Steve, look at Alexa, the Amazon Alexa. It sounds really smart until you ask any question. There's a lot of them where Alexa will say, "I don't think I understand that. I don't get that. I don't under." And then you go, "Alexa, you're sort of stupid right now. These are simple questions, and it can't, not even close." And so it sounds really good. It's kind of gimmicky. It works well. We have one at home, but it doesn't know. I'd say 3/4 of what we ask, it has no clue. No
Well, I
clue.
think at
When
that
you
point,
mention-
Alexa's
when
probably
you
too busy
mention that-
grabbing your data to send back to Amazon, isn't it?
Yeah, when you mention that name, can you please talk quietly?
You
Because
have
I
one?
have that in the room.
That's funny. Well, this has
Yeah,
been a great
so
So anything
conversation.
else? We're almost at the end of time, Steve. Any sort of final last points that you'd like to sort of bring up or raise or?
I think that there's a real sense of change in the air, but it's patchy. There's change happening in some areas of society and in some large organizations where others are not following along with it. And so in effect there's almost like a tearing of the fabric of what we see happening around us, and this differential is going to cause problems in the future. You're going to get some organizations left behind. They'll try and adapt, they'll struggle to survive, and others will forge ahead and like Google and Amazon and probably, I don't know, some of the other large digital organizations, they're going to start vacuuming up the hoovering up, I think is the another expression, the remnants of what's left, and I fear for that. But I think organizations that will survive will be those that learn to adapt, that learn to become agile, that learn to help their workforce to become prepared for anything. And right at the start of my book, I asked the question. I ask you to ask the question, the reader, and I ask you to ask the question: what is it that you can learn that will never be out of date? And then, how can you take that learning and share it with the rest of your colleagues? And how can you prepare them as well? That's my big, I suppose, challenge for the book, really.
And that's actually a very big question. I'm sitting here going, what could I? That's a good one. Tying your shoes. I don't know. I was thinking of all sorts of little goofy things, but that's actually a pretty good question. I like it.
You see, I asked a question at a university recently. There were a group of nurse educators, and they were saying, "Look, we've got 3,000 students." I said, "How do you teach them?" They said, "We teach them in 10 batches of 300. We have a big lecture theatre, and we all sit there, and we give them an hour's lecture, and then we roll them out, and the next lot come and we do the same lecture again, 10 times every week." And I said, so how many come along the following week? They said, well, half of that. And how many come along the week after that? I said, they said about a quarter. And so they're losing. There's an attrition rate in those kind of organizational structures where maths education just does not work because it's lecture, lecture, lecture. So I said, okay, so why don't you think about ungoogleable questions? They said, ungoogleable questions. Is there such a thing? I said, yeah, of course there is. Yeah, I said, no, because I've just made it up. But the thing is, ungoogleable questions grab people's emotions and they grab their intellect and they throw it to one side and say, okay, what are you going to do with it now? Because you've never heard about this before. This is a new challenge for you. And there are dozens and dozens of ungoogleable questions out there, things you cannot Google, things that you have to struggle. Learning is in the struggle, you see. So the more you can get your colleagues and your co-workers to struggle about something, the deeper they're going to learn something. And that's back to your question about shallow and deeper learning, Rick. We've got to promote deeper learning as well as the micro learning, which is just chunk by chunk stuff.
Right. Because what you have is people think that they're experts and their knowledge is about that deep. You got about less than a centimeter of knowledge, and you go, and you just dig a little bit, and you realize they know nothing, and that is an issue when they're in a field. I'll give you an example: doctors, medical doctors. I have been to my share just throughout the years, usually accompanying somebody, but I've been fortunate never to really be sick. But I show up at the doctor's office and they go, "Oh, are you a doctor?" No. But you know this. I read and I'm interested in medicine and I teach martial arts on the side, so we have to know first aid and things that, and they go, "But how would you know that?" It's learning it, and I took classes when I was younger, but they're amazed that anybody knows anything about medicine, and you just go, we all should know something about medicine, but I think as a society we know just enough to know what a doctor is, and not much past that, and it's just sort of a shame that we have come to that point of extremely shallow learning, which is good, at least knowing something, but they can't go much past that. And that's where you get the issues of how do we get something done right, quality control, everything else. But Steve, this has been a wonderful conversation. We hope you come back on. Lesley, thank you so much for sharing Steve with us, because he was your idea. And
no, it's not my idea. He just happens to be a good friend and colleague.
We always ask Lesley, who do you know? Who can you bring? And she always has great recommendations. So we appreciate it. And Stephen, again, thank you so much for coming on to the show, and we'd love to have you back on. I think we were just touching the surface of things.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot more we can talk about, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
I'd love to
lots and lots and lots.
We're going to have a lot of fun.
Yeah. You'll have to come back. You'll have to come back to London, Rick, because I say Steve, or you could go to the other shows that the Learning Technologies group run, because I say Steve's been out in Asia. They now run one there, and you never know, Steve. You might be going to some of the ones they're now running with the eLearning Guild in the States.
Yeah, like DevLearn. DevLearn's a big one out here, and that's in Las Vegas, I think.
He's saying he wants to get me out there.
Yeah. Well, if you go to DevLearn, we're going to be at the Vegas one this year. So if you are there, we'll definitely get together.
It'd be nice to get across the pond again one day.
It'll be fun.
Yeah.
Just be careful what airlines you
Okay,
take.
thanks,
But
Steve, and it's
have a
thanks
good
ever
one.
so much for taking the time. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone, and we'll see you next week
Bye.
on eLearnChat. Bye bye.
Bye.
And that's a wrap. Thank you.